There's a story taught by Rabbi Isaac Luria, a 16th century rabbi, and it goes something like this. In the very beginning, before the world was created, the universe was filled with God's holy presence. When God spoke the words, "Let there be light," light was created and poured into vessels. But this holy light was too powerful to be contained, and the vessels split open, with tiny sparks of God's holy presence embedded in fragments of the vessels thrown in all directions. It's from this image that we get the Jewish teaching of tikkun olam, or repair of the world, that it is our human task to gather up the fragments and their holy sparks, to seek and restore God's holy presence through acts of mercy and loving kindness. This is the image that comes to mind for me when I hear today's epistle. Now, this is the second time that Paul is writing to the church in Corinth. He wants to address some challenges to his authority as an apostle. It seems that some people are comparing him unfavorably to other popular charismatic teachers. Some wonder why Paul hasn't returned to visit them as he'd promised. Some question why he doesn't have letters of recommendation to prove his qualifications. And still others wonder why he continues to earn a living as a tent maker instead of relying on wealthy patrons to support him as respected teachers would do. In response, Paul wants to make clear to the believers in Corinth that he himself is not the source of his ability to articulate the gospel. Rather, the credit belongs to God alone. It is God who has called him to share the gospel. And Paul's credentials lie not in boasting or in proving himself, but in his ministry experiences, in the meaningful relationships he's made, and in the significant challenges and persecution he's encountered along the way. In chapter 3, he writes that together we all see God's glory as though reflected in a mirror, and that we are being transformed into the same image through the power of the Spirit. And in the excerpt we hear today, Paul writes, "It's not ourselves that we proclaim, but Christ, the same God who said, 'Let light shine in the darkness,' has shone the light of Christ into our hearts, and this is how we come to experience God's glory." And then, an unusual image. We have this treasure in clay jars, so that it may be made clear that this extraordinary power belongs to God and does not come from us. Treasure in clay jars. In Paul's time, clay jars would have been everyday objects used to store all sorts of materials like wine or oil. Valuable, to be sure, but certainly not treasure. Treasures would have been kept in vessels of gold or silver. Frances Young, an English theologian, offers an insightful commentary on this image. She finds resonance between Paul's image of clay jars and the creation narrative in Genesis 2, in which God forms a person out of dust or clay and then breathes life into that being. And the human form houses the breath of God. She also notes that the words that Paul uses for clay jars are heard in Leviticus too. Clay jars are used to hold sacrifices offered by the priests in the temple. So, life, breath, and sacred offering. She writes, Paul focuses on the inherent creatureliness of human beings, on the divine spirit within, and on the creative power of God, which is capable of transforming bodies so that the mortal is taken up into the eternal. our creatureliness and God's creative power. We hear this contrast in verses 8 and 9 of this text. Paul writes, "We are afflicted, but not crushed, perplexed, but not driven to despair, persecuted, but not forsaken, struck down, but not destroyed, always carrying around in the body the death of Jesus, so that the life of Jesus may also be made visible in our bodies." In our bodies, we carry around the death of Jesus so that his life may also be made visible. It's a paradox. It doesn't make logical sense. Now, we may not be used to thinking of our bodies as vessels for God's light, but this passage invites us to do just that. And it's not some idealized or perfect bodies that we aspire to someday. It's the limited, imperfect bodies that we have right now. What could that possibly look like? Over the years in L'Arche, many people have brought this notion alive for me. People whose bodies carry both great limitation and great life. Now, I want to be careful not to minimize or to idealize the difficulty of living in a body that doesn't do what you want it to do. But at the same time, I want to acknowledge what I have experienced as God's light and God's grace revealed in and through others. I want to tell you about Tracy. Tracy was tall and long-limbed, and when seated in her wheelchair, we were about eye to eye. She could not speak with words, but boy, oh boy, her face could express 1,000 words: discomfort, annoyance, irony, mischief. When I was in seminary, I went to school during the week and spent weekends at Tracy's home. During the week, I read books and wrote papers. But at the end of a long week of study, Tracy would call me out of my head and back into my heart and into my own skin. From the moment I'd walk into her house, Tracy would draw me in with her exuberant greeting. It looked like this. Her usual position was with her head down and her arms dangling at her side. She couldn't really sit up straight. But when someone she loved walked into the room, Tracy would gather her energy and her arms would start to stiffen with excitement and jerk unsteadily up into the air. And then her head would rise so that you could see. Her brow was furrowed and her mouth was tightened into a frown that, with some serious effort, gave way to a little smile, and then a huge grin, and then a gasp of joy as she called out to greet you. I'm told that when Tracy was younger, she was self-conscious. She wasn't comfortable in her body and all its limitations. She didn't want people looking at her. She didn't want to be in public or on stage. But as she grew into adulthood, somehow she found a sense of confidence and groundedness in her body. And her okayness was contagious. Others around her caught it, and its impact on us was profound. Moving around with Tracy wasn't always graceful, but it was almost always grace-filled. What I mean is that somehow between the two of us, we managed to find a rhythm of moving together as a task required of us, getting in and out of the bath or moving from bed to wheelchair and so on. It might not sound like much, but it was in fact a remarkable sequence of nearly impossible maneuvers, made possible only through giving and receiving, moving and resting. Tracy loved choosing her clothes: bright colors, pinks and purples and reds, bold prints, flowy skirts, palazzo pants, fancy hair, makeup, nail polish, bracelets, scarves, shoes, you name it. She had an endless capacity for accessorizing, and she would get very annoyed if you tried to rush through that part of her morning routine. The last thing you did before she left her room in the morning was to wheel her in front of a full-length mirror. And there she would raise her head and take in all her beauty and beam at herself and at you standing next to her. And you couldn't help but feel okay about yourself too with Tracy standing in front of that mirror. It truly was something to behold, a generation of young women assistants who, in the process of helping Tracy, came to learn confidence and healing in her loving gaze. Tracy never escaped that reality. She just stood in her truth and invited us in with her. I don't know how she did it, but I do know that in her lifetime, she did more than her share of gathering up the holy sparks around her, encouraging, transforming, and restoring. I remember one young woman, Jen, a university student who came to spend a week in the community. Jen had been trained as a classical dancer, but had left the world of ballet some years earlier as she worked to recover from an eating disorder. Jen spent the day with Tracy in her day program called the Spirit Movers. It's a group of dancers of varied abilities. Some use wheelchairs, some not. The Spirit Movers do just that. They move your spirit. And it's not through their skill. It's just something in their gentle, grounded presence, moving together in and through all of their imperfections. I don't remember anything about their dancing that day, but what stands out in my memory is when Jen came in to say goodbye to Tracy before she went back to school. They talked for a moment while I was in the next room, and I could hear Jen talking softly, and I could hear Tracy calling out in response. After a little while, I popped my head into Tracy's room, and there she was, sitting up tall with her face beaming and her arms stretched out. And there was Jen with tears running down her face as she said to Tracy, "Thank you for teaching me how to dance again." We have this treasure in clay jars to show that this power comes from God, not from us. We are always carrying around in our bodies both the death of Jesus and his life. This is good news for those of us who can't imagine how God's Spirit might possibly be at work in our bodies, in all of our afflictions, our aches and our pains. It's good news for those of us who are struggling or anxious or tempted to despair. It's good news for those of us walking with someone we love through a time of darkness. That somehow the very God that brought light to the cosmos at the beginning of time is offering light to each one of us, still, here, now.